In this discussion, we're going to continue our topic, psychological self, but this time we're not going to use the lenses of cognitive development, but rather we're going to talk about other perspectives in psychology, particularly about personality. And we're going to talk about a lot of theories and psychologists who have major contributions in the field. Okay? So last time we talked about how we develop cognitively based on the perspective of Jean Piaget. This time we're going to look at other perspectives and how we develop. And this time let's begin with Harter's self-development concept and basically the way that we describe ourselves develop. Okay, our self-concept. So when we say self-concept, that's how you view yourself. So parts of the self-concept can be I am a good student, I am responsible, I am smart, I am not good with this and that, I am helpful. So that makes up your self-concept. Okay, so basically the way that you describe yourself evolves or changes as you go through the different stages of development. So be aware of your self-concept right now by listing 5 descriptions you have about yourself. Okay, so after you do that, you are now more aware of how do you see yourself. And you know what, the way you see yourself changes depending on the stage of development that you're currently in. Okay, so let's take a look at these stages. First, let's look at early childhood. In early childhood, children describes themselves in terms of concrete observable characteristics, material possessions, behaviors, and preferences. So the first, let's discuss these one by one. First, let's begin with observable characteristics. Remember how you relate with your siblings, with your cousins when you were a child. So when they ask you to describe yourself, then first you can describe yourself when it comes to observable characteristics, saying things like I'm handsome, I'm pretty, I'm strong, I'm big, I'm small, I'm thin, I run quickly. Okay, so those are observable characteristics. I'm a boy or I'm a girl. Okay, next we can also describe ourselves when it comes to material possessions. Say, for example, I have lots of toys. I have big toys. I have small toys. I have toys that are cars. I have T-shirts that have cartoons. Okay, I play with toy cars or with dolls at home. So that's how you describe yourself when it comes to material possessions. We also describe ourselves with the behaviors that we have. So for example, I love playing with toys, I like running, I like jogging, I like playing, okay, I like watching TV, and that can also be your preferences. Like I like candies, I like pizza, etc. I like cookies. Okay, so that's your self-concept. Basically, it revolves on these 4 things: observable characteristics, material possessions, behaviors, and preferences. That's for early childhood. And eventually, you will move on to middle to later childhood. And when you move on to this stage, the way that you describe yourself also changes. And in this stage, you describe yourself in terms of traits. Later on, we're going to talk about traits when we get to other perspectives. But when we say trait-like constructs, you say descriptions. Okay? So when you are in the grade school, you describe yourself in terms of characteristics such as I'm shy, I'm behave, I'm kind, I'm smart. Okay? You're no longer relying on I like candies, I like cookies. You're less like to describe yourself in terms of those things, because now you learn how to describe yourself in terms of characteristics or trait-like constructs. When you get to adolescence, you learn how to describe yourself in an abstract manner. Remember what I've been telling to you about the stages of cognitive development according to Piaget, that when we reach the formal operational stage, we now become aware of abstract concepts such as our inner thoughts, emotions, attitudes, and motives. And we do not just rely on concrete definitions, but this time when you get to adolescence, you describe yourself by looking at your inner thoughts, emotions, attitudes, and motives. So you describe how do you feel? Are you nervous about your presentation? Your inner thoughts. You are going to say that you're reluctant about something. You're going to say that you doubt something, or you're skeptical, or you believe in something. Your attitude, you're going to say how you feel about something by saying that you support it or you do not support it. And your motive, why are you doing it? So you describe your motive. So I'm doing this for my family. I'm doing this for my friends. He or she is doing that for himself or herself. Okay, so that's how we describe ourselves when we are in the stage of development. Then eventually, when you're in the emerging adulthood, so this is a new term in psychology, because back then from adolescence we jump to adulthood, but right now there's an emerging concept called emerging adulthood. And typically this is sometimes they call it second adolescence. And when does this happen? The emerging adulthood is in the early 20s. So because in our country, in the Filipino setting, when you are in your early 20s, you don't live alone, or you don't move move to another house immediately, but rather that's more likely to happen in your late 20s or early 30s. So Filipinos still live with parents at this stage. That's why we don't our stages are not parallel with the stages in other countries. Typically in the early 20s, it's like we're still in the adolescence, or we're living in a second adolescence. That's why it's called emerging adulthood. And in the emerging adulthood, we describe ourselves in terms of possible selves, or what do you want to be. And why do you think the possible self is at this stage? It's because in the adolescence, you're still in the stage of finding out what you really want. That's why you're less likely to be sure what is it that you want to do when you become an adult, and this is more likely to be figured out when you are in the emerging adulthood. So now that you are in the emerging adulthood, you are now conscious about what you want to be, what your dreams are, and what are your plans, and you're more likely to be capable of looking towards the future. In our previous discussion in sociological self, I gave you a preview, or I spoke about the I self and the me self. And I hope that you remember that. Basically, William James proposed something similar to what we have discussed in that discussion. Okay, so it would be worth it to take another look at it. So William James is known as the father of American psychology. He is a great contribution to the field of psychology in the United States. And according to him, there are two sides of the self, the me self and the I self. And now let's take a look at his perspective and how do these two differ with each other. According to William James, the I self is the subjective self that is aware of its own actions. So it's describing yourself using the word I, or from your own perspective. It's the I from within. Okay, describing yourself using your own perspective. Okay, so what are the features of the I self? So if you use the I self, you're capable of the following. So the first one is that the I self gives you a sense of being the agent or initiator of behavior. So let's compare that with the me self. Say, for example, choosing a course in college. Let's compare the I self and the me self. So the me self may say something like, my parents want me to study this course. But when you use the I self, you would say that I really want to study this course. So now, if you use the I self, you have the responsibility over your own behavior. You realize that you're the one who make choices, and others are not the one who's going to make choices for you. So with the I self, you realize that we are capable of making choices for our own lives, and that we are responsible over these choices, instead of saying that your choice is the product of other people's choices. Next, the I self gives you a feeling of being unique. So the I self gives you the capability to say that Unlike other people, I am blank. I like math. I like studying. I like reading books. Unlike other people who are, who have negative attitudes towards a certain profession, I think that they are not that bad. Okay? Unlike other people, I think, I feel, I believe. So that's the I self. Other than that, the I self gives a sense of continuity. So it allows you to have one continuous identity. So when we say continuity, you know that the self doesn't change. Who you are yesterday is still who you are now. It doesn't mean that you don't evolve, but rather, it doesn't mean that you have a new identity every day. Okay? With a sense of continuity, you have the capability to remember what happened in the past and connect them with what's happening in the present. For example, you have the capability of saying that I remember that yesterday I did this, that's why now I'm doing this. I remember that when I was a child, I was taught by my parents that I must be respectful to adults. That's why right now I am being respectful to adults. And that's about being continuous from the past to the present. We should also have a sense of awareness. So when we say a sense of awareness, the I self is capable of telling where he is, who he is, and what is the time. Okay, he is aware. Is it morning? Is it afternoon? Is it the night? So if you're aware, what do you feel? What do you think? Okay, are you conscious about what you're doing? Okay, so that's one capability of the I self. Okay, because sometimes when we rely so much on me self, you just behave in a way that other people want you to behave. So typically we redirect the thinking of our clients by saying that, for you, what do you think? That's what they think, right? But in your own perspective, okay, what can you say about this or that? Okay, so that is for the I self. Now let's talk about the me self. The me self is the self that is an object or the self that you can describe. So this is from the perspective of others or the more objective self. Okay, so according to William James, there are three perspectives of the me self. The first one can be the material. Okay, so they think of me as smart, they think of me as handsome, they think of me as helpful, okay, as they think of me as fit. Okay, so that's the material self. Okay, and next is the social self. They think of me as friendly, they think of me as someone who knows how to behave well in social situations. They think of me as a helpful individual. And lastly, we also have the spiritual self, or describing yourself when it comes to personality, character, and values. Okay, so that's the I self and the me self. So be conscious. How does your me self differ in comparison with your I self? Okay, and which is more helpful to you? Sometimes we have to strike a balance between behaving in a way that others want us to behave, and behaving in a way that we think would be the best for us. Okay, now let's shift to another perspective, and this time let's take a look at humanistic psychology. So humanism is one of the perspectives in psychology which is a bit similar to philosophy because it has philosophical roots. So humanism emphasizes the active role of the individual in shaping their internal and external worlds. Okay? And one of the most important humanists would be Carl Rogers. Okay? And Carl Rogers believed that the person is an active being who lives in the present. So, according to Rogers, you don't live in the past or you don't live in the future, but rather what's important is that you live in the present, because there are other theories who would emphasize the importance of the past. For example, Sigmund Freud would say that you behave like that because of your childhood, but Rogers is more likely to bring you to the present. Is more likely to make you realize that you have choices, even though you were taught of something. If you were behaving in some way because that's how you were in childhood, Rogers would emphasize that you have the capability to change. Rogers coined the term actualizing tendency, or one's capability to reach his or her highest potential. So I guess you're familiar with self-actualization, and maybe you're familiar with the theory of Abraham Maslow. Okay? Both Maslow and Rogers are humanists because they do believe that people have the capability to actualize. Okay? So, if Maslow was very popular with his hierarchy of needs, okay, and Rogers is popular for what we call the person-centered theory. So let's talk about his perspective. So Carl Rogers' person-centered theory believe in the following concept. The first one is the ideal self, or you have the capability of thinking who or what you want to be. So people may say things like, I want to be a good musician, I want to be a good engineer, I want to be a good psychologist. So that is your ideal self. And you also have what we call a real self, or who you actually are. Not all the time our real self will match with our ideal self. Okay, say for example, what if your parents are forcing you to study a certain course, but you don't really want to study that course? Say for example, what if your parents are telling you to become a doctor? They are trying to change your ideal self, but your real self says that you actually want to pursue a career in another field. Say, for example, what if you actually want to become a teacher? So sometimes we feel congruent, sometimes we feel what we call incongruent. So what are the things that may influence congruence? Okay, so when we say congruence, that is the alignment of the real self and the ideal self. So if you're psychologically healthy, you'll be able to know if your behavior is matching your ideal self. Because there are other people who think that they are kind, who think that they are helping others, they think that they're very generous, but they are not conscious that they are not. Okay, for example, they're behaving in a very negative way, but they think that they are very helpful. Okay, so we need to make people conscious about the incongruence between their real self and ideal self. When we say there is incongruence, there is an inconsistency between who you are and what you want to be. Okay, so sometimes our ideal self may be unhealthy. That's why it's important to form a healthy ideal self. Because sometimes your ideal self can be, for example, what if you are perfectionist? Okay, you have perfectionistic ideals. What if, say for example, in the case of those with eating disorders, their ideal self is a self that is underweight. So that is their ideal self, but I won't say that that is a healthy ideal self. And when we form our ideal self, we have a lot of influences. Say, for example, what you see on TV, what you read in magazines, what your parents say, the opinion of the people around you. That's why it's important for you to be aware of what are the healthy ideals and what are the unhealthy ones. Okay, so that you are less likely to feel incongruence and you're more likely to feel congruence. Because according to Rogers, when we feel incongruence, that's when mental illness happens, or that's when mental illness develops. Another humanist is Gordon Allport, and he is the one who actually coined the term humanistic psychology. And Allport is known for his perspective about traits, okay, personality traits or personality characteristics. First, let's talk about functional autonomy. So Allport believed that we are functionally autonomous. So what does that mean? Allport believes that human motives are functionally independent from the original motive responsible for the behavior. In layman's term, he believes that people continually do something that they have been doing for quite some time. However, your motive or the reason for doing that behavior may also change. What does that mean? Say for example, when you were a child, you recite because you will get a star. Now that you're an adult, you still recite, but you don't do it for the star, but rather sometimes you participate in recitations because you want to feel good about yourself or you want to have a higher grade. Another example, when you were a child, you take a bath because your parents told you to do so, But now you take a bath because you want to, not because your parents told you to do so. So humanists emphasize the importance of choice, and we have the capability of choosing. We're not stuck to the past, but rather we have the capability of shaping what we want to be. Next, he is also known for his view or perspective of traits. When we say traits, these are enduring characteristics that manifest itself almost all of the time. So what does that mean? When we say that something is a trait, we're saying that it's a characteristic that is observable for a long period of time. So be careful when you say that some characteristic is a trait, because sometimes it can be about labeling. So be careful when you say that this is a trait. Okay? Sometimes we have instances wherein we say that someone is someone is lazy, and that is his trait. He's really lazy. Let us be careful not to label someone as lazy, because what if they incorporate that belief and they think that they only have negative traits, and they will only behave in a way that they will, you know, they will confirm that belief that other people think that they're lazy. Okay, so we need to be careful whenever we label someone when it comes to traits. And for in the psychological perspective, we help people become aware of their traits, not by simply labeling them, but rather we help them become aware by giving them tests, by giving them surveys that allows them to realize what their strengths are. Okay, so one of the most famous theories in traits are the big five. So I hope you're familiar with the big five. Okay, the ocean. And so typically what we do is that we measure the extent to which people are high in openness, or sometimes they're low. Another example of trait can be introversion and extroversion, consensuousness, and there are a lot of traits. Okay, so that's one of Allport's contribution. He believed that we have characteristics that may manifest almost all the time. Okay, so it's important for us to know your traits, because sometimes your traits can be negative. What if your trait is that you're highly anxious? Okay, so you may be anxious in almost all the situations. It may be hard for you to deal with life transitions. What if you have an upcoming exam? So if you're highly anxious, it's very hard for you to stay calm in that situation. Hence, it's also what I'm stressing here is that with the awareness of traits, it allows us psychologists to also help people to be able to control their emotions and behave in a more productive manner, in a way that they will have a better quality of life. Another perspective in psychology is Eric Berne's ego states. Okay, so according to Eric Berne, his perspective is that we have three ego states, and these are the parent ego state, the adult ego state, and the child ego state. And let me discuss these one by one. When we say the parent ego state, that's the voice of authority within you. So that's the side of yourself that tells you the do's and don'ts. Okay, say for example, if you're about to do something bad, your parent ego state will tell you that, do you really want to do that? Do you realize the implications of what you're going to do? Okay, so basically, Berne is telling us that we have a part of ourselves that acts like a parent to our behavior, a parent to ourselves, and it's responsible for the do's and don'ts. Next is that we also have an adult side, or the rational system. The adult ego state is the one that decides that what he or she wants to do. Okay, the one that is in touch with reality, the one that is rational. Okay, while the child ego state, or the childish part of you, is the one that can be spontaneous. Like when you observe children, they're very spontaneous. Okay, they do what they want. They don't take up responsibilities. They're very they live in the moment. They live in the present. But at the same time, the child ego state can also be impulsive. Like remember a child who wants to eat candies, who wants to eat chocolates. Okay, so what's important is that you learn how to balance the demands of the parent ego state and the child ego state. Okay, so if you're familiar with the theory of Sigmund Freud, the counterparts of these three are in order. The parent ego state will be the superego, the adult ego state will be the ego, while the child ego state will be the id. Okay, and that's basically Eric Berne's own way of explaining the superego, the ego, and the id. And just like Freud, on the other hand, Freud believed that a healthy person is not someone dominated by the superego, not someone dominated by the id, but rather a person, a healthy one, is dominated by the ego. Why? If you're dominated by the superego, then you will always say no to everything. Imagine the life of a person who always say no in all the enjoyments of life. Then a superego dominated person is someone who is very conservative or someone who is very perfectionistic. On the other hand, someone who is dominated by the id is someone who is very childish, someone who is very impulsive, someone who does not think rationally, but someone who behaves in a way that will fit with his desires. Okay? Someone who wants immediate gratification. So you want to balance the demands of the id and the superego by making the ego the dominant one, or the rational, make the rational side of you the dominant one. So always balance the demands of pleasure and the demands of authority. Lastly, let's discuss Winnicott's true versus false self. Okay, so let's close our discussion by knowing that our self can be divided into a true self and a false self. So first, let's talk about the false self. So the false self is can be the product of early experiences. It can also be a defensive organization formed because of inadequate parenting. Okay, so the false self is the self that is obedient to parents' wishes and demands. So say for example, your false self can be someone who wants to become a lawyer or a doctor. You don't really want to become a lawyer or a doctor, but you always say that because that's what your parent told you to say. Okay, so that's one example of a false self. So that's not really who you are. But a false self may not always be unhealthy, it can also be healthy. A healthy false self is still connected to the true self. So even though, for example, your false self is that you are very generous or very kind. But in reality, you're not that kind, you're not that generous, just average. But at least you're trying to do something for you to become more generous, for you to become kinder to other people. You don't want to have an unhealthy false self. So when we say unhealthy false self, you continually adjust your behavior to fit in. So it's unhealthy because you're trying to present a side of yourself that is no longer real. For example, you're posting a lot of pictures in social media to fool other people. For example, you post pictures in the social media that you're sad, but in reality you are not, or the other way around. What if you post that you have a very what's this? You're very happy, but in reality, deep inside, you're very sad. Okay, so we don't want people to live in their false selves, but we want them to become more aware of their true selves. So, what is the true self? Let's talk about that. When we say the true self, so this emerges if the mother is responsive to the needs of the child. That's why we want more parents to be more respectful to children. We want parents to listen to children. We want parents to listen to what their child really wants to be. We don't want parents forcing a child to become someone else that they are not. Okay, so a parent must be responsive to the needs of the child, not just physically, but also psychologically. So if the child wants to excel in music, then as a responsible parent, why don't you provide more opportunities for your child to be able to exercise, or to exercise his skills in music, or to be able to have fun by singing songs or by learning instruments. So the true self is the one that is creative, the one that is spontaneous, and the one that is real. Okay, so we want people after this discussion, I hope that you become more aware that sometimes in our quest, in our journey to develop ourselves, sometimes we develop a side of ourselves that is no longer real and that's no longer healthy for you. We want you to become more aware of what you want to be, because trying to live a false self is not healthy for you all the time. And sometimes it's the reason why a lot of mental illnesses emerge or a lot of mental disturbances emerge. Just like in the case of those who try to live a perfect life, even though that's not really the goal of living. So basically, I hope that you learned a lot in how does the self develop from the psychological perspective, and I hope that you become more aware of your self concept, especially as you grow older. So that's it for this discussion, and thank you.